Welcome back to our Living the City double feature lecture series here in the former airport of Tempelhof. Super excited to be back in the exhibition. It's been a long time for all of us. Living the City is an exhibition, it's a publication, it's a program of events, and it is also a discursive platform about cities, about people, and about stories. My name is Lukas Feyreis. I'm co-curator of Living the City, and on behalf of the entire curatorial team, that is Tatjana Schneider and the Green Isle, a warm welcome and thank you for being with us here today. The setup of the double feature remains the same. I always have two guests with me, two speakers. Each of them have about 15 minutes for a short presentation of their work, and then we will engage in a kind of brief question and answer. All in all, we will be here together for no longer than 60 minutes. So today with me is to the left, Canadian but Berlin-based artist Larissa Fassler and Berlin-based artist Raoul Walch. Both I've known for many years. I believe one of the common, let's say, denominators in our talks will be, in a way, the artist as an explorer and a researcher within the urban environment or the urban context. And I will start with you, Larissa, briefly introduce you and your work before you can do your presentation. We were just talking about when we first met, and I believe it's now almost 14 years ago. In 2007, I was working on a book called Beyond Architecture that looked at different artistic practices that kind of deal with the motif of architecture or the city. Then we worked together, I think 2 years later in 2009 in Dresden for the Australe. And I showed a couple of your models. Then a year later, actually, I was invited to write a little piece on your work. It was called, I think, The Body and the City. Mm-hmm. And then there was another book in 2014, Imagine Architecture, and now for this exhibition, Living the City, we have a piece of yours actually also hanging on the wall. So it's been a long time, a long trajectory of a lot of overlaps and connections. Your artistic practice is deeply involved in the discussion of architecture in the city. You try to, in a way, analyze the built environment in which we live. You do this in a very meticulous way. You're trying to kind of read and translate the urban space and their various transcriptions into like seemingly conventional means of architectural representations, meaning scaled down architectural models, cartographies, maps, mm-hmm. sketches, and floor plans. So, and then take it to a whole nother level, no? And offer a completely different view on these things. So I'm extremely excited that you're with us today. And for now, the screen is yours. And thank you again for being with us.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I think it was also interesting what you said about writing a piece about my work quite a while ago about the body and the city, because in my work, I'm always looking at the way public space and the shape of public space affects users and inhabitants, and equally how users and inhabitants also kind of put their mark back onto the city and change it through their use. And I do this, as Lukas said, using my own body. So I take tools, yes, from architecture and urban planning and anthropology and sociology, but I also develop my own tools of walking a site, counting my footsteps, using my own body to explore and understand place. Today I'm going to show two projects. One is a series of works based on Cottbusser Tor in Berlin, and the other is Place de la Concorde in Paris. I just wanted to show this table of contents, which is actually meant for a book, but I think it shows a good overview of the two places I work the most, which is Berlin, my home city, and Paris, a city I go back and forth very often. And I think it's also important to work on cities where I have a deep knowledge. And then occasionally I've jumped into other contexts. So I worked on Taksim Square in Istanbul, and I worked on 3 North American sites, Calgary, New York, and Manchester in New Hampshire. Cottbusser Tor. Cottbusser Tor is in Kreuzberg in Berlin, the west of the city. This neighborhood is really interesting because it was a neighborhood of artists, of squats of other forms of alternative housing. It's also the heart of the guest worker waves of immigration in Germany, so it's the heart of the Turkish community. It was a place where when the wall ripped just north of Kreuzberg, a lot of people sort of left this area and therefore other groups came in. And what I found so exciting about Koppenster Tor itself, although I lived very near and would always sort of look at this building and go, oh my God, like it's this mega slab that crosses 2 streets and I don't know if I love it or hate it, but it represented to me a really kind of fascinating urbanism in that you have different groups. You have the Turkish community, you have a very important gay lesbian bar, kind of all side by side, and it works in a kind of force tolerance side by side that I think is really key to how cities can work and how urbanism can work. I didn't know how, when I first arrived in Germany, to get the plans for the places I wanted to work on. So I wanted to have the map of Koppenster Tor, or the plans. And so this is where this body developing method arrived, in that I decided I wouldn't try to find the plans. I would just go every day myself, walk it, count my footsteps, go down all the back alleyways, go into tunnels, and try to find every accessible space that I could access. And numbers, when they appear in my drawings, always represent the number of footsteps. I was doing all this because I intended to build a model of Koppenster Tor in order to understand it. So here we have the final piece. It's a 3 meter long by 3 meter wide model, 1 meter 50 high, and it shows the accessible spaces of Koppenster Tor. So we see the above ground U-Bahn, we see the subway, you see the roundabout, you see plazas, but what's left as empty holes are the streets, private shops, and the large building itself. I liked incorporating that large building because those balconies for me acted almost as theater boxes on the urban play, and I think that they play an important role also in that urban space. Here's a view of what those holes look like, the private space or the inaccessible space going through the model. And what I love about models too is, of course, when you photograph them closer, you put your eye into it, you get all of a sudden these views of reality as if you could almost be walking down those corridors of Koppenster Tor. A back view and a view against my own body, just so you can see it for scale. Of course, in being on this site, I think I was on the site kind of over a period of 6 months, walking, observing. I started to become curious about the site's history, and just behind Koppenster Tor is the Kreuzberg Museum. And I was going through their archives, and on that upper left corner, you could see the site before they built the mega slab that went across. Oh, and I should say maybe also that mega slab was an interesting kind of discovery for me in itself. Today I would perceive it as kind of an ugly move in city planning, but at that time, of course, it's a 60s, 70s build. It represents a kind of clean, affordable, modern housing compared to what the housing stock of Berlin would have been like at that time. There was pretty big housing shortages. You would have had multiple families sharing one toilet on the landing. These would have been coal heating and pretty miserable flats. And so I found it interesting to see this building as also a kind of utopian vision for a better architecture and a kind of, yeah, like I said, affordable solution for social housing. There were plans to rip a highway through Kreuzberg. That's in that upper right corner. And on its diagonal corner, you see the Koppenster Tor from the back, cutting across the street. You see how very few windows there are, and it's this concrete mega slab, and that was to be a sound barrier to protect the lower neighborhoods from this highway. The neighborhood demonstrated so strongly against the highway that it was eventually stopped. And then I was also collecting social history. I would look at the different demonstrations that were happening in Kreuzberg at Koppenster Tor, about rent rises, about other movements throughout the 60s and 70s about nuclear energy. And you've got the police in that lower corner also running and tear gas behind him. And that's the 1st of May demonstrations in Berlin, which in the 80s would have been pretty heavy. A lot of cars burned, really heavy clashing between police and alternative groups and labor movements. And this sort of created legends also about Koppenster Tor being a dangerous place. And when I moved to that neighborhood in 2004, that kind of attitude towards Koppenster Tor still clung to the site as as a myth of the site being dangerous. And that was also one thing that drew me to looking at the site more closely, is when you moved through that site every day and spent time on it, danger was not a quality I was feeling. And so I was questioning why this myth of place hangs on. So I would collect, as I said, all the historical photos and redraw them in pencil. These are preliminary sketches or a research phase. I was redrawing newspaper articles about the Turkish community. I was collecting billboards, signs, stickers, graffiti, other kind of interaction with the building surface, and I was redrawing all of those in kids' pen in the original colors, so quite garish colors. This is another example of all of those researches. I think there are hundreds of these A4 pages and a detail. All of this information I would then scan into the computer and in Photoshop build it like a major collage or mind map, placing the historic elements back into a Kaposur where I think they would have taken place, placing the signage back in, and creating this kind of overall impression of Kaposur. Again, footsteps are always numbers on the site, and you have this deep, deep layering of place. An image just so you can see the scale. I love that the viewer is also encouraged to walk, and so you have to take a few steps in order to take in the whole drawing, because they are at quite a scale. And then this is a site that I've gone back to a number of times to watch how it's changing. So this is the latest iteration that is in the show here. It's the 2014 version. The place is even more soaked in kind of interaction with its surface through language and billboarding and stickering. I'm going to read, just in case our viewers can't see the screen, and the English translations. And I find so great that you can kind of hear a political voice by reading a surface. And so the kind of language you'd be hearing at Kaposur would be your city, your country, your passport, Hebrew vocabulary workshops, support Turkey, Gezi protests, Humanitarian Congress Berlin, rooms needed, support refugees, I love Kati, make noise, we won't pay for your financial crisis, Berlin Turkish Association, Berlin doesn't love you, Adele, 98.8 Kiss FM, Lady Gaga, victim insurance, alcohol, know your limits, we want you the way you are, A-OK Insurance, halal, video surveillance, stop rent rises. And also on these images, as I was talking about myth making, when you put Kaposur into Google, the hits you get, at least on my browser, are bars, restaurants, danger, clubs, cafe, drugs, cinema, maps, drugs. So again, thinking about how places have myths and legends created around them. If we're okay for time, I'll introduce one more piece.
Yeah, you can.
So as I mentioned...
Beautiful presentation so far, thank you.
Sorry?
Beautiful presentation so far, thank you.
Thanks. The other city, and the city I have a really deep connection to, is Paris. I work with a gallery there. It's a site I've spent a lot of time in residencies. My husband's French and our home language is French, so it's also a site I've been thinking, or a city I've been thinking a lot about. And one of the more playful projects, I think, was thinking about Place de la Concorde. So it's this important historic site. I really felt I should go and look at it, thinking about major plazas and cities and what they offer. And this is sort of the romantic historical view. And yet when you go there, it's 8 lanes of traffic, rather hard to cross. The weather is normally appalling. You have driving rain, you have wind, and as a pedestrian, you really wonder why you, as a tourist especially, why you should have gone here. So most tourists will come out of the Tuileries Gardens, hit this plaza, have an incredibly difficult time crossing it, and try to get up the Champs-Élysées. I love signage, I love collecting kind of an interaction with the city surface, and this is what I was finding, these kind of dry, dusty, big plazas, not any kind of graffiti, not any kind of signage, and I was really trying to figure out how I would map and what kind of information I would take from this place. I was watching tourists take selfies, tourists run for buses, and I was watching the Sinti Roma teens have a small kind of sub-economy of asking tourists to sign petitions. And so I was sort of watching, and I very much decided that this plaza was about movement. It was about tracking how people would get stuck on the plaza or cross the plaza and when they'd stop and start. So I started doing these little hour sketches where I would see somebody I liked in a yellow top, and I would follow them about 2 meters behind and track their movements across the plaza. This is a 1-hour study. Another day, another 1 hour study. And then all of these studies, I would, again, I use computer tools all the time. I would scan into the computer, project in my studio, and retrace these lines. It's a 3 meter wide drawing by 1.5 meters high, and it is a week's worth of movement across the plaza. And I really sort of see the associations now to veins in the body, to the movement of water, and I loved kind of letting a place dictate the kind of information that one can take from it. I'll show maybe 2 details. Little X's are when people stop and start. And otherwise we have the movement line where people stop around the famous obelisk and the 2 fountains. And again, other movement lines. And a last image so we can see scale of the pieces. This was at FIAC alongside Jona Friedman's models. Yeah, and from my side, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Larissa. I think it's a beautiful introduction to your work, and I think we can cover a couple of topics that have developed or changed also over the years, no? In your artistic practice. You said it yourself, you are kind of visualizing the kind of thicket of signs and codes and messages that we find in the urban environment in all its kind of complexity and heterogeneity. And in a way, you appear, as the researcher, the explorer, but also almost like the tracker or the scout in this whole process. What I would like to start with you, the first question maybe is regarding the relationship that you in particular showed in the first project between your body and the architectural works that you relate to. I think it's a practice that you're not doing as extensive anymore, but in your first series of works, you always used your own bodily measurements to come to an understanding of the spaces that you analyze. So the Cottbusser model, you literally measured with your own footsteps and with your arm lengths. And interestingly enough, this topic or the relationship between the body and the city has been a reoccurring one in these double feature lecture series with a lot of different, whether it's performers or choreographers or architects. We always came back to this century-old analogy between the city and the body. It goes back to the beginning of like Western architectural history, so to speak. But could you elaborate a little bit more on this, or your understanding of this relationship between the body, particularly your body, and the city?
Yeah, and I always laugh because in some of my earlier models too, I would be trying to measure it with width, and I would also like write me plus a hand plus an arm to try to get tunnel heights, and those little notes showed up in the drawings. I think the body and the city for me, it's a way also to interject subjectivity into these kind of drawings. I think at the beginning I had assumed I was doing something objective and very quickly understood that that's impossible and incorrect, that this kind of drawing is, yes, I'm trying to map everything, but it's completely selective what I'm pulling out. It comes from my position and point of view, and therefore even the act of using my body was a way to underline that subjectivity. I also some of these places are not that comfortable to walk. So down some of those back corridors of Kotti, they are dark, they are not so many eyes on the street. There was a way also of using the body to almost as a feminist act to also say I will stand here and I will walk down this corridor. I spent 3 months in the Gare du Nord every day standing there walking around, and there was kind of a claiming of that space of there is no reason I should not be able to stand here for 6 hours and walk. And there was a way of forcing my body to also be in those spaces as a site to also claim those spaces as my own, although I really don't enjoy that much being seen and being visible. So there's this funny thing about doing something peculiar in public space by people see you doing the funny walk across corridors and counting, and at the same time kind of not wanting to be observed. So that double...
And this kind of making the invisible visible and the other way around, I guess, runs through your work, which will also connect very much to your work, I think, later, Raoul. But you just mentioned, that's really interesting. This is another connecting point, I think, that will show up more in our discussion later, is this idea of somehow being a neutral observer and at the same time of this really strong artistic subjectivity in the work. Because the works appear objective also by the means that you're using. It's a cartography that we kind of have an idea of being something very objective. yet it's highly subjective, whether it's your perceptions of the movements of people, or it's actually your own body, you know? So there's these opposing positions or poles that I think make, for me, the power of both of your works, actually. Another thing that I would like to ask you before we turn towards you, Raoul, and then maybe we engage in a discussion together, is that you mentioned, I think you called it deep knowledge of two places, Berlin and Paris. Berlin, where you live for now, 20 years, and in Paris, where you regularly go back and forth to. Because I've been lately become very interested in the ideas of situated knowledges. So in how far sites and spaces kind of relate to or inspire kind of our practice, our way of thinking. Yeah. In how far do you believe does the city of, you're Canadian born, you grew up in Canada, but Berlin has been the basis of your life or the center of your life now for many years or decades. And how far do you think that Berlin or even Paris have kind of affected your own thinking? So I don't know if you understand where I'm coming from, but I'm curious on the relationship of the site, of the place that we live in or that we grew up in, on our way of working, looking at the world and thinking about the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, and I felt this most kind of consciously when I worked recently in America. So I worked on that small city it's called Manchester, but it is in New Hampshire in the US. It's near Boston. And I arrived and I was really shocked by things that shouldn't have shocked me because I grew up with them. So I was shocked by the grid city. I was shocked by the dominance of cars. I was shocked by public space not really functioning very well, although it was offered. And I think all those things really shocked me because I was in my head comparing it to Berlin, where I think the way public space functions here has really kind of ingrained in me a sense of how public space can function quite well. A width of sidewalk that is so generous that it offers to people kind of a room of play where cafes can spill out, a bike path can pass by, there's a row of trees, there's this kind of offering of a civic space, although it is just a sidewalk or a passageway that still functions incredibly well, or a very good public transportation system, and how that is also a public space where I am forced to brush up against people and be with people who are not of my social bubbles, and yet we function and tolerate well in public space. And then when I hit the ground in the US, and these things really surprised me about, when a sidewalk is broken and crappy and doesn't encourage me to walk, no one does. And kind of, I realized unfairly, I was actually comparing it to Berlin, it doesn't quite work because the city is so much smaller. It's 100,000. And so some of the crush of crowds that I was expecting or the interesting mixity of people wasn't present. But I think this kind of deep ingrained knowledge from a place from where you come is absolutely the case.
And this is maybe a nice passage to you, Raoul, because you work often, almost all of the time site-specific, but all over the world in completely different cultural context. Quick introduction to you, Raoul Walch, Berlin-based artist. We've known each other also, I think, for 15 years. We were introduced, we a common friend, Sophia Babas from Frankfurt. And then you studied with Olafur Eliasson at the Institute for Raumexperimente. There was a lot of overlaps that we had there, 2009, 2010. Then we worked on a project in Rotterdam in 2011 or 12, where I curated like a public street festival. We have become close friends over the time, and we worked in 2009 on your first monography of your oeuvre. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks for the invitation.
As I said, you work site-specific, but in your artistic practice you cross a lot of, let's say, boundaries of common art genres, in the sense that you are a trained sculptor actually, but in a way work more as a conceptual artist, but then you slip very often into the role of the performer in your own work, so you become also the center of your own works. You are similar to Larissa, a researcher and an explorer, and in a way have entered also the almost like political domain in many of your works. It's always very unconventional, I feel. There's always an artistic examination of, let's say, the global socio-political realities that you reflect on, in an artistic, but often also in a kind of bit humorous way. So, screen is yours now, and let's take us to some of your projects.
Thanks for the introduction. So you mentioned a lot of topics, let's say. I have to focus on some of them. But yes, as you said, I work a lot in different fields and have a more strong background in visual arts. But I'm interested in many aspects of our life in especially the city. And for this presentation, I wanted to focus more on two spaces that they're not unconventional, but they are, let's say, difficult to deal with as a visual artist. And one is the water space, and the other the airspace. We are at the Flughafen Tempelhof, at the airfield. And I have worked a lot with wind as, let's say, a co-producer or a main aspect in my work. And that's why I chose to talk about works that are related to wind and to airspace. Airspace, you could also say the public space. In the city, we call it often public space, but not all of my projects are related often to the city. But especially for Berlin, when I was studying here, I developed a series of works with flags, where I was not feeling as a researcher, more or less a person that spends more time in a certain space, that spends time outside, and I was maybe at the square where people are passing by, and I am similar to you, Larissa, as well, spending more time at the space and looking at the movements and looking at the colors and looking at the buildings, the let's say environment, and that was kind of my inspiration. And the flag works were at the beginning more or less interventions on flagpoles that were forgotten in Berlin. I had a little map, a city map of different locations of flagpoles that were abandoned because the building was lost, or sometimes, as from GGR times, the, let's say, country, the nation was lost, and the flagpole got abandoned. So I used these for hosting my own flags, and through this I also started thinking about what they were standing for, and often they are related to national representation. I was thinking, this is not what I am interested in this flagpole as a representation of nationality. So I started to abstract the color setting of flags, and I started to work with abstract pattern on these flagpoles, and started to work with textiles as well. So I can go now through certain images that are more related to projects that came afterwards. So from my interest in flagpoles and this airspace, I was then also producing different works for exhibitions. Actually, as Luca said, all over the world, different places, always site-specific works on flagpoles. These images are mostly from Berlin, but I reflect on different aspects of the space, of the colors I find, of the pigments that I can that relate to the area, and so on. I collected patterns from architecture, from movements, from different ideas that I had while spending time in these locations. But also this work with textiles and on buildings, on architecture, on the environment, led to much different art projects, and I will slide to some of them. I was talking about the water space as well, so that's another interest. So if you work with textiles and you work in the outside, I came from working with flags to working with sails. Then I'm not particularly interested in boats or sailing, but these were interesting surfaces for me. Then to continue my work, I will just quickly slide through images, but coming back to buildings and to architecture, let's say, I often then developed works for exhibitions that I said before are using textiles to cover a building, to weave, in this case, through a building. That's a fake facade from a prominent, not rebuilt building in the Berlin center. The Bauakademie, also called Schinkelbau, was just a scaffolding which is now deinstalled. But the scaffolding somehow was my weaving structure, and I was weaving a very soft element through the whole scaffolding, and also opposing a bit this a firm and really, let's say, old-fashioned idea of reconstructing a place, rebuilding a memory, constructing a memory of a place that maybe never existed in this certain way. But to go on, to slide through more projects, I show some images of other buildings I was doing, let's say, textile interventions on, and giving the surface of the building, scratching the surface of the building with a soft element. And in this case, this image is from Addis Abeba, where the textile can also be used for different purposes. So we also had picnic events on the textiles. So it's also using these materials for different opportunities, for different ideas, and it's also a very let's say ephemeral intervention, because as these buildings are often concrete buildings, or let's say often built for, let's say, ever, these textile interventions are not for long, but they change. Often the colors change of the textiles through sun, rain, and the wind. The material transforms, and the shapes are transforming, and that's why it's also opposing very much the architecture that it's related to, because often they have exactly the different idea, that they not move with the wind, that they're resisting these elements, and I'm often working with them. So to go on, I show just some images of structures or textiles. I was also building shelters or spaces that were then used for different activities. The previous one in Baghdad, in Iraq, a cultural festival, a roof construction that gives some sun shelter. In this case, a tent structure in Dresden. Also a roof structure for multiple usage. In this case, it was an intercultural festival. I go more from building, let's say, shelter structures or tent structures to flying structures. And in this project, in these images, you see a project in Dresden, which I realized with a group of Syrian architects who were in this time new in Germany, they were forming a group. I still sometimes work with them, with people from this group. It's kind of a long time friendship, but it was also the idea to produce something in Dresden, in the public space that is more visible and that can give a light flying structure to the city skyline. And later on, this flying dome was then presented in an exhibition. And from actually talking about water spaces that I tried to use and air spaces, I come to this project, which is just not opening exhibition, which opened or should have opened last weekend. But this project combined actually the work with wind and water in one floating pavilion that is moving, changing directions with the wind. So the sail is actually it's giving the pavilion the possibility to move with the wind and changing its direction, but also a platform on the water to talk about certain topics that are really much related to problems of our time, such as the rise of the melting of the poles or the rise of waters in general. So also confronting us with the water spaces we have is also always political project or has political means. And so Lucas mentioned it at the beginning. So all of my projects also, because they are in the public, they are also in a public political space, they always relate to some political interests I have or some political topics that I work on or I want to point out, such as I mentioned as well before, the topic of national identities, which I think are more interesting in talking about citizenship, and this is really much related to cities as well. So I just continue maybe here talking less about politics, more about public interventions. And in this case, it's a series of fountains I'm working on still. One project I actually realized with Lucas, Feireis. Am I still in time?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah.
You have another 3
thanks.
minutes.
Fine, fantastic. A fountain project, so to say. I used actually the general water supply system for this ephemeral waterworks in different locations. This is in Berlin, but here you can see the tools actually that are really basic Baumarkt tools to opening hydrants to have this short water fountains, and sometimes longer, sometimes short interventions. You get interrupted by mainly people that are thinking of the waste of water, where often the waste of water is not really a topic, but in this case it was often, or people call the police to stop the water flow, or some people might think there's a broken tube, kind of system failure. But these interventions were really much related to water. As I said before, that is one of my interests in this presentation to show, and it's also opposing this firm urban environment that we are creating. It's kind of a soft force, but it's still shaping our environments very much. So, to continue to one of the last projects, I also worked on these mobile fountains. So a fountain is usually an element that is installed in a park or in a certain environment where you show the domination of mankind over nature, or let's say to have also a water movement in a pond to generate oxygen and so on. But in this case, the fountains were more used to go to abandoned spaces, to maybe a parking lot, to maybe a neighborhood which maybe needs actually a fountain, a place where people gather and have a joyful moment. So these movable fountains are still something I work on, and let's see. It's also maybe a good way to have a car equipped with water in the case that it's maybe burned on the first of May. You have an easy solution for a car burn. My last project I'm showing is actually Tempelhofer Feld project I realized here 2 years ago with the floating university, was just on the other side of this building, a very nice initiative, and I just wanted to mention it, and a project I produced with members of the floating university and the refugee camp here on the field, which is now closed, but 3 years ago was still in use, and with members of both groups, I produced this kite flying project, and that's actually the last project I want to show for today.
Thank you so much, Raoul. You brought up a lot of topics. First of all, thank you for bringing in this kind of notion of the water and the air spaces, because it's something that we tend to not really think of so often when we reflect upon the urban environment, even though within the exhibition we have actually focused also on these like water infrastructures with Swim City, a project here by Jörg Egli from Switzerland. And also thank you for kind of all of relating back to the building that we're actually sitting in a former airport, that you did the projects here on the airstrip, that this used to house, I think, 30,000 refugees here, where we are actually sitting right now. So there's a lot of like site knowledge right here where we are sitting. On the other hand, you kind of brought a topic into the game that's just as you, with the relationship between the body and the city, kind of went all the way back to this old analogy in that it's a European tradition of relating our body to the city. You went also all the way back to somehow almost the primordial hut with the shelter or the tents that you have created. And a discussion that we often had is this notion of the textile origin of architecture. So that's Gottfried Semper and his idea of architecture, that we have our first skin, our second skin is clothes, and the third skin is architecture. So there is this really like long discourse always behind both of your work that are very now and very contemporary, but you can draw back, quite far. And then maybe that's where we can get into is another interesting parallel you're using, let's say, in your very subjective works, these kind of traditional means of architectural representation, like the cartography. You're using also a very conventional mean, namely the flag. That's how you started, of actually territorial claiming and national representation. But then the beauty of it is that you abstracted, but it's almost more a utopian claim you make, because suddenly there's no national connection anymore, but it's in an imaginary country. It's a projection space almost.
And people project in it, so people try to read it and ask me what it is for, which they always related to a territory. Not in every exhibition space where there's a museum maybe, which also use the flagpoles as an advertisement and so on. But often, these buildings have a certain representational need, and then it's also a fight with authorities in a way that flagpoles have a certain rule how to use them. So you have to have a lower flag when some national event is happening, or you have to put up the national flag. So there are also a lot of layers behind realizing a project like this. It's not always just hosting it. It's also about convincing people that it's more important to have an art project going on, which kind of makes people maybe reflect about national identities or signs of that, or representational signs. Having them reflect on it might be more important than just hosting the national flag.
It's interesting, while you in a way analyze and visualize the thicket of signs that's already existing in the public space, you create new signs, abstract signs within the public space. Maybe we can talk about this in a second. Another one, and before I would like to ask both of you a bit more about your kind of methodological approach to your works, is and you mentioned it before, the ephemeral nature and the performative nature of your works. They often, things are being used in multiple ways, and in a way the observer is always also the participant in a way in most of your works. So there's, I don't know, this notion of the social plastic or social sculpture in a Beuys sense. Can you elaborate a little bit on the for you as an artist, on the power or the pros and cons of doing ephemeral works, so temporary works in public space that are only there for a moment? The fountains, they're very almost romantic kind of ruptures of how we see the city, and suddenly there's this almost baroque fountain that appears in a very, an urban, gritty environment, and then it's gone. But yes, can you reflect a little bit on this?
I mean, in a
temporal
sense,
nature?
the presentation I made, or the images I shot, were a bit misleading, because people were missing in these images, and they were just talking about the action that happened, or exhibition that happened, and so on. But the ephemerality lays in the moment that we have together, that we share when maybe this fountain is happening in front of my office building, and I just go out and ask what is going on, and I enjoy the moment for half an hour break, because this is not what I have expected in this space, and it suddenly gives me a moment of joy. And this happened a lot. Also, kids come to play, so it's a joyful, playful moment that art can allow or make happen in a sense. And this is difficult to documentate, in a sense that if you would have a camera team, it totally destroys the situation. And these picnic sessions on textiles that were before a flagpole is also a practical, let's say, transition of a material, but it's also maybe a critique of an art piece itself, that is also, as a building, something to preserve, or to kind of touch with gloves instead of muddy hands.
You also, interestingly though, create civic space. Like, it's interesting that on a big field, when you put in Dresden, I believe it was the tent or the Baghdad roof garden, by somehow making the space special or giving it, paying attention, you've created a public space or a civic place that gives a place meaning somehow.
Yeah, it's a transition for a moment. It's not something to maintain, but that makes it as well special. Because the questions would be much different if I would know that the structure is now there forever. For me, I would kind of maybe use it much differently.
Yeah, it's beautiful also in the context now of this exhibition, Living the City, which kind of gathers, examples from architecture and art and urban planning and civic society and politics on making of cities, or addressing the question of making the cities. And you do both read and make cities in very different ways, that open up a whole new. If you engage with it open up a whole new perspective on the sites we inhabit, on the places and spaces that we inhabit, and Yeah, I was, as I said before, I would be curious. We have about like another 10 minutes left for our discussion. Understand a little bit more in short, so in a nutshell, again, where do you think where did it come from, your interest in like dealing with the city? You more from an analytic point of view, yet extremely engaged in it. So we see these kind of cartographies, but they're based on you spending months over days and days on one side, and you actually working in public space. Where do you think this interest in the city, in public space, in civic space, how we use, how we move, how we live in places, in spaces, where does it come from?
I've been thinking about this a fair bit recently, because I think for me, it actually comes from having moved into a new country and into a new society. And so I find that at the beginning, when my language skills weren't very good, as a survival method, as a way to learn how to fit in better, as a way to even learn how to like participate and belong, it became very key for me to watch what other people were doing, to try to figure out the rules of this place or how we're expected to move in these places. And then when I moved from Canada to Berlin, and then, as I said, moving into French society, and you're again hit with kind of this place is so different, not only because of its urban history and how the city has built up and moved and its other histories like a colonial past, but then you're also thinking gender here is treated very differently. Multiculturalism and questions of who's included and who isn't is very different and compared to Canada and Germany. And so I was constantly struck with, why is that so? Like, why does this place function so differently? And I think I got kind of glommed onto public spaces. That was a very kind of accessible place for me to sit and watch and try to learn about how societies function.
I like the public space. I think it's the space of possibilities, and it's the space that can be for free for everybody. So it was just maybe a very personal interest, and for sure there are a lot of other spaces that are offered to do art projects or artistic projects, but it was kind of a decision to work with or try to engage with the viewer that is there, maybe unconscious of seeing an art piece, or maybe randomly passing by. So,
and would you, if I kind of ask a bit further, but where do you think it's not? I mean, in our context within this exhibition, we're all dealing in space. It's always, we take it for granted, but it's not really for a lot of people that are, not familiar with this kind of artistic research of the urban environment or the engagement in public space. Where would you say, I mean, you explained it's interesting that the position of being a foreigner in a place makes you, look at things more closely to kind of find your own position in things. Where's this interest in like intervening in public space rooted in your kind of biography?
I mean, strong idea is also to change it, to maybe change it to a better accessibility, or to allow it to have more activities going on. So I think it's not just me that wants to change the place. It's also hoping that this leads to a certain way of dealing on a maybe political level different with public space. I mean, now we see that there's a lot of more participation going on in how public spaces are designed and how they will be used in the future. So this is kind of a right step in a good direction, that we don't have this abandoned spaces and all over the city. I mean, for me as an artist, they are great. It's great to have spaces that nobody sees, that are in the middle of town, like an intervention you do really on the Museum Island in the city center, which is kind of very representative in a way for not just Berlin, but maybe internationally. And you can just use it as space for artistic intervention, it's great. But it also shows that there is a lot of kind of empty and unwanted space, inaccessible space, and
but somehow those those undefined spaces are also what I always found so fascinating with Berlin. They're all kind of spaces of potential. Like I know other
That's
cities
true,
where Paris, where their space is so packed and everything is full and everything is used, that I always found it kind of amazing here that because of coincidences of history, that there were these lands that a lot of people, guerrilla gardening or artists, could kind of move into and use. And
now there's still a potential to use them, but let's see. I mean, that would be also a question from me to your research on Coty, where you now have this really wide view of historical dimension, let's say, of how this place has changed through the last 200 years, let's say. I don't know. But what do you think? What is the?
I think looking at the time, these are some of the questions that we will have to engage more deeply at another occasion. But I think what's maybe more key here is the topic of the potentials or possibilities that both of your works kind of open up. No, they're kind of the potential and the possibilities that the spaces we inhabit offer, and in a way, both of you are blurring the boundaries between the artistic research and the object of research that you engage with, and thereby you also kind of probe to which extent I believe art can be considered in like a reflective and insight generating practice. This is what we're trying to do in this exhibition as well, that artistic projects can really open up a new way to look at the city in a much more effective way than maybe a classical urban planning project or an architectural project. That said, I'm very thankful for both of you kind of bringing these insights with us. You earlier said that in kind of you hear a political voice by reading surfaces. You just by analyzing the surfaces, you can read a political voice. And you brought in this idea of also the soft forces that relate obviously to the textile nature of your pieces too, but the soft spaces and the soft forces that are like transformative and ever transforming. These are maybe two notions that we can take with us from our discussion today. That said, I would like to thank both of you for joining in and being with us. Thank you, Larissa. Thank you, Raul. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, Reframe, for putting this together and filming everything. And on behalf of the entire curatorial team, that is Tatjana Schneider, the Green Isle, and me, Lukas Feireis, I would like to welcome you again next week for our next double feature series. We are very much looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you and stay safe.